Thanks for the introduction. Today we're just going to start off with a quick case of environmental justice before diving into some sort of orienting concepts for environmental justice. Sarah will take care of that. But first off, we're going to start with the case of ASARCO. So in February 2008, the American Smelting and Refining Company, also known as ASARCO, was granted an air permit to reopen its El Paso, Texas copper smelter by the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, which is a Texas state-level institution charged with environmental protection. This is a unique case of environmental injustice because the ASARCO smelter site was located in a densely populated metropolitan area that's at the junction of 3 states and 2 countries. The permit entitled this multinational corporation to emit 7,000 tons of pollution annually into the airshed, including 5 tons of lead, which would have been more than any other facility in the United States. And this airshed was shared by Texas, New Mexico, and the state of Chihuahua, Mexico. Okay. Now this is a map of the region. At the center is the actual ASARCO facility. You can't really see my laser light very well. But as you can see here, it's situated at the junction of El Paso County, Texas, Doña County, New Mexico, and the Municipio de Juarez, Chihuahua, Mexico. And so it's situated right at the juncture. We're talking literally, it's in the state of Texas, in El Paso County, but yards away, a stone's throw away from both Mexico and the state of New Mexico. And what this map also highlights here is all as public schools and early childhood education centers that are identified as points in all of these surrounding areas. And schools were of particular concern in this case due to the documented linkages between lead and child health and detrimental effects on childhood development. Okay. Now, ASARCO has a very long history in El Paso, Texas. The smelter actually started operating in 1887. This photo is taken in 1899, I believe. And the facility operated continuously until 1999, at which point the price of copper dropped to about 60 cents per pound. And because of that, ASARCO decided to mothball the facility, to the jubilation of a lot of people living in El Paso, because we've talked to a lot of people who've lived there longer than us and heard some stories about the air quality and the impacts on just their well-being. Okay. So until 1973, resident workers at ASARCO lived in what was known as Smelter Town. And this was a company community that was located at the base of the stack. ASARCO actually neglected to include this community in its air pollution monitoring. And actually in 1973, the whole community was razed. It was demolished because it was documented by non-company sources that more than half of the children living in Smelter Town had lead levels that were considered dangerous. They were being poisoned by their location there. And this was uncovered by actually now one of the world's leading experts on lead poisoning issues. His name is Philip Landrigan. In 1975, he published this in the New England Journal of Medicine. And maybe the best thing to come out of this was the fact that Landrigan got deeply involved in these lead poisoning issues and was actually instrumental in passages of laws within this country to increase the standards and protections for lead pollution. All that really stands of the community today is the cemetery that's shown in this image here. So ASARCO has a very long history of toxic pollution and corporate irresponsibility within this country. The corporation saddled citizens from about 75 communities in 16 states across the country with at least $6 billion, perhaps as much as $20 billion in environmental remediation and cleanup costs. Reliable sources reported that a comprehensive cleanup of current contamination in the El Paso area would cost in excess of about $250 million. If the smelter had reopened and polluted once again, as was the intent back in 2008, estimates of those remediation costs, of course, would have gone up. The impacts on human health would have continued again. And ASARCO's public relations campaign, interestingly, actually, in this lead up to trying to reopen the facility, they had advertisements focusing on the quality of the air and how they were so concerned about the environment and the impacts on health. But really, their history does not point toward a model of sustainability in terms of their impacts on human health, ecosystem health, and impacts on the environment generally. So why did ASARCO actually want to reopen? They mothballed the facility in 1999. And so why did they want to reopen? Particularly a facility that was so noxious. It was going to release 7,000 tons of pollutants that are known to cause adverse health effects per year in the middle of this metropolis with an estimated population somewhere between 2 and 3 million people. They'd actually decommissioned smelters in other US cities. For example, in Tacoma, Washington, and Omaha, Nebraska, those smelters have been mothballed and they've been taken offline entirely. Well, for sure it was influenced in part by the spiking price of copper, which had risen to greater than $3 per pound in 2007, which was just immediately before the onset of the Great Recession, right? Okay. Now, why the price increase? Does anyone have any ideas about why copper was so valued and continues to be? It's a question for the audience. Yes?
Maybe the war, they need the copper for metals, materials?
Well, the materials are definitely in high demand. Certainly in high technologies that are used in warfare. But in general, in high technology devices such as computers, cell phones, all of the devices that we tend to rely on in our everyday lives require copper. And that was really the big reason for the spike in prices of copper. Okay. But to be sure, I mean, based on our experience, it's hard for us to disconnect this desire to open this polluting copper smelter. It's hard for us to not connect that with the characteristics of people that live within the region. The vast majority of nearby United States residents in the city of El Paso and adjacent Sunland Park, New Mexico, are Hispanic. El Paso and Sunland Park have lower median household incomes than Texas and national levels, and poverty rates well above the US rate. In addition, the portion of Ciudad Juarez that's abutting the facility is home to that city's most socially marginal population. And these are just images of some of the housing situations that surround the smelter. There's apartments very close to the site, lower income apartment complexes in El Paso. There are also some single family residences. These are near Sunland Park, New Mexico, very close by. Really the most densely settled residentially area surrounding the facility. And this is an image taken from Ciudad Juarez, looking sort of northwest toward the smelter. And this is a very densely settled area residentially. This is an image of a lot of these homes in Juarez, pretty much right up against the stack nearly. Just right across the river, we're talking a couple hundred yards perhaps. Okay. Now there was a lot of activism against this. There was a lot of citizen and governmental response to this. So elected officials from the cities of El Paso, Sunland Park, and Juarez, as well as the states of Chihuahua and New Mexico, officially came out with statements opposing the reopening of the smelter. Really the only government agency that was implicated here that did come out against it was the state of Texas, right? Who ultimately actually had control over the decision to reopen, to grant the permit. Okay. Many citizens also voiced clear opposition to the reopening of the smelter. So you had civil society groups on both sides of the border. You had ACORN, Association of Community Organizations for Reform Now. There was a local group that got off the ground called Get the Lead Out Coalition. And the Sierra Club very admirably got involved in this case too locally. And they all collaborated in protest against this reopening of the smelter. For example, in March 2007, ACORN and Get the Lead Out activists took direct action in Austin, Texas, by storming the Capitol and demanding inclusion in the air permitting process. Over the summer of 2007, ACORN canvassed local neighborhoods to inform residents of the threat of the smelter if it were to reopen. And they enlisted people in their petition drive to deliver local voices of opposition to Austin. During the public comment period for ASARCO's air permit, which ended in June 2007, over 10,000 letters, about 10,480-something letters were actually submitted to the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. 9,600 letters were in opposition to the reopening of the smelter. 800 and something were actually in support of the reopening of the smelter. In September 2007, local groups actually organized a community photo that they actually posted on a billboard in Austin where a lot of state legislators drove by, and they delivered this photo to the governor. And this was called Faces Against Asarco, and it was part of the mobilization effort. And who are those people? Those are actually us. We participated in this, and I showed this image. I managed to sift through this and find us in this photo. But I wanted to emphasize that we are not actually, we're not unbiased participants in this. Our home is within a few miles of this facility. And in fact, I could talk for a while about our university's sort of relation to this case and the stance they took on this case. But we felt like we were going to be a great risk if this facility opened. We're only about a mile away. The land where our university is located was actually originally donated by Asarco. So anyway, we were looking to move. We were probably going to move if this facility reopened, or at least look to move. Many other people in this region wouldn't be fortunate enough to be able to just pick up and move and find better jobs elsewhere. Unfortunately, this opposition proved to be an unsuccessful influence in the permitting process, as the decision to approve the air permit was ultimately made by 3 governor-appointed Texas Commission on Environmental Quality commissioners who decided that they would grant the permit. Okay? In their influential 2001 book, From the Ground Up, Luke Cole and Sheila Foster state that current environmental decision-making practices have not been effective in providing meaningful participation opportunities for those most burdened by environmental decisions. And I would argue that what happened here in El Paso substantiates that, provides a good example of how local voices were never included in the decision-making process. So why did the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality grant Asarco this permit? A simple response is that this governor-appointed committee has never actually denied an air permit to any company that has requested one. The commission is viewed by many as a regulatory body designed to facilitate the profit motives of big industry. It must also be realized that El Paso is very marginal in relationship to Texas's centralized political engine, which is located over 500 miles away in Austin. This means that local voices in El Paso are less likely to be listened to, even if they're heard. Also, it's really difficult to contemplate this case without considering the role of environmental racism as a factor. A predominantly working class, dark-skinned community was engaged in what seemed like a rational public debate about the prospect of opening one of the United States' single most noxious facilities in its midst. And we've had visitors come during this period of time. They found it almost surreal that we were having this sort of public debate about whether it would be good to allow the smelter to reopen or not. And from our experience, what I would say is that residents of wealthier and wider communities are almost always spared the experience of being forced into engage in such debates. So what options were opponents left with after that air permit was granted? So they were in a tight spot. Undoubtedly, people who were against the reopening of the smelter felt really powerless after the permit was granted. One option was to try to sort of grab onto something that would enable them to litigate against Asarco, to keep them from reopening. Okay? Now, since El Paso's facility is located less than 1 kilometer from both Mexico and New Mexico, transboundary pollution would have negatively affected the primarily lower-income Hispanic populations of both of those jurisdictions. And the transnational movement of toxic pollution from the global north to the global south has actually received quite a bit of attention in the environmental justice literature. The Asarco case provides an example of this trend from my perspective. The fact that the air permit had been authorized in Texas and the facility would have acutely impacted adjacent state and national jurisdictions without the consent of any territorial governing bodies from those places may have provided some leverage legally for opponents against Asarco. For example, the Paso Agreement of 1983 is an agreement between the US and Mexico that calls for the two countries to collaborate together, to work together to eliminate sources of pollution in their respective territories which affect the border area of the other. Okay? We'll never know if that sort of line of opposition would have ever gained any traction against the facility. Additionally, the permit granted by the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality only pertained to air pollution, but ASARCO's pollution had already affected and was going to have worse impacts on water and soil resources in the region, of course to the detriment of human and ecological health. The facility is actually located just meters away from the Rio Grande, and this is the river that provides about half of El Paso's drinking water, as well as water to many people who conduct agriculture in the region. In fact, there's a canal called the American Canal that sits right at the bottom of a large pile of slag, a large pile of hazardous waste from the facility. And so we know for a fact that these water resources in the region have already been impacted by ASARCO's operation. But maybe because the air permit only pertained to air resources, opponents could have gained some traction by arguing the fact that it was going to cause water resource damage too in the region. Maybe that would have provided leverage. Ultimately, we'll never know, because ASARCO actually failed in its efforts to reopen the El Paso smelter. And it's hard to know exactly what the influence was. To be sure, though, the change in federal administration had some impact. Of course, the Obama administration came in 2008. The Environmental Protection Agency under the head of Lisa Jackson is more focused on environmental protection. They have genuine concerns about environmental justice issues. And very quickly after the administration came in, the national ambient air quality standards for lead were actually reduced to 10% of what they had previously been. And this would have definitely imposed costs on ASARCO. They would have had to change the technologies they were using at their facility, which would have cost money in order to open the facility and meet those new standards. They denied, though, ASARCO adamantly denied that this change in the national ambient air quality standards had any effect on the decision. That's hard to believe from people who are familiar with the case. Another thing that happened is that the price of copper plummeted. Okay? And this was as a result of the global economic crash and recession. And it dropped from above $3 in 2007 to around December of 2008, just above $1. And that made it less desirable to operate the facility for it to make less profit on the product. So as a result, ASARCO announced that the site would be decommissioned permanently, and this led to a lot of celebration in El Paso. Okay? An interesting note is that ASARCO was purchased by a South Asian or an Indian transnational mining corporation. And that corporation actually bought up all of ASARCO's assets except for the El Paso smelter. No one really knows why. My belief is that they probably got wind of the vociferous opposition to ASARCO reopening in the area, and they concluded that that facility was not going to be viable economically in the future. So the facility was decommissioned, and there's no chance of it ever opening again, thankfully. Okay. Also, there was a bankruptcy case, a very complex bankruptcy case that ASARCO was involved in. And ASARCO actually filed for bankruptcy to try to shed liability for all of the environmental damage and remediation costs that they were being charged with. It was a way of shedding those liabilities, filing for bankruptcy. In any case, as an outcome of that bankruptcy case, ASARCO, the site in El Paso is now being remediated. It's been placed in a trust, and $50 million was allocated, which is at best about a 20% of what a comprehensive cleanup cost would be based on some informed estimates. And this is to be carried out over the next 400 to 500 years, this remediation plan. And so this remediation plan, if we start thinking about this in terms of intergenerational justice, in terms of unsustainability, I have to conclude it's unsustainable. It imposes injustices on future generations because it compromises their well-being in the region, the contamination of the site. This is just an image of the site being remediated currently. This is an image when remediation just started, looking down towards the Rio Grande. And this is what the same location is looking like now. Really what they're doing is capping the site with asphalt. They're putting in what they're calling, I think, some sort of a wall. They're putting in a wall between the site and the river that's supposedly going to hold back water moving down to the river from the site, which would lead a lot of contaminants to leach into the river. But of course, this is going to be porous, this thing. It's not really going to hold back all the water. Okay. So in summary, the environmental injustices that are implicated in the Sarco's proposed reopening of their El Paso copper smelter were many. The lead emissions would have been most damaging to young children and pregnant women. El Paso is one of the poorest cities in the United States, with a majority-minority population that lacks power within the state of Texas and is socially marginal within the American context. Located at the edge of the global north, residents of Mexico would have been unfairly impacted by a Sarco without receiving a single benefit. So ultimately, justice and sustainability in this case partially prevailed. However, the problem with how measures of justice and sustainability were achieved in this case is that the outcome was pretty random. It was serendipitous. To learn more broadly applicable lessons from this case, we have to ask ourselves a basic question. Will shifting political winds, economic recessions, other vagaries of the global marketplace yield sustainable and environmental just outcomes consistently? And of course, this is not the case. What we have to realize is that in order to achieve more sustainable outcomes everywhere, we have to demand, create, and vigilantly protect decision-making processes that are genuinely inclusive and environmentally just. And so at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to transition over to Sarah, who's going to introduce some key concepts and principles of environmental justice in the historical context of the movement.
Thank you. So yes, we thought we would start with the case of Sarco today to give you an example of a really dramatic, in our opinion, case of environmental injustice. And then we're going to take a step back and talk some about what is environmental justice and injustice. So that's what I'm going to do today. So to begin, we have to start with the question, what is the environment? Right? Tim's talking about environmental injustice, intergenerational equity. So from the environmental justice movement's perspective, the environment is where we live, where we work, play, learn, and pray. So it's a very people-centric definition of environment, right? It's not just the trees and the forest, right? And the beautiful landscape, for example, you have here around campus, but it's where we live, where we work, where we learn, pray, and play. So what is environmental justice? Just to give you a basic definition, and I'll tell you that this definition is actually the one that's been adopted by the US EPA. It was originally developed by Robert Bullard, who is a very important figure in the environmental justice movement. So just to read the slide, what is environmental justice? The fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all peoples, regardless of race, color, national origin, income. More recently, scholars are also looking at gender in this definition with respect to all development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, policies, and regulations. So I hope that when you see this definition, you clearly make the link with the case of Sarco, and obviously people weren't being treated very fairly, but they were being left out of the implementation of environmental laws, the setting of the standards, and all of that. And connected to our theme today, I see in this definition as well a value of multiculturalism, right, in people of different backgrounds. And if we were to achieve environmental justice, I think we would probably achieve some semblance of sustainability as well. So what we're speaking about today does hopefully link to the theme of this session. So environmental justice would be achieved when people live in socially just and ecologically sustainable communities, right? When we value multiculturalism. And I'm not going to have you answer this question right now. At the end of the presentation, we may be able to come back to it. But it's good to think about what would environmental justice look like. Because what we're going to do today is give you 3 more examples of environmental injustice. Right? Often scholars of environmental justice actually study injustice. Right? We study when it goes wrong and things are not sustainable and are unequal. But it's important to always keep in mind, what would justice, environmental justice, really look like? And then how can we work to achieve that in our society? So before I dive into the case studies here, we want to take a step back and think about different categories of equity or justice. And so when scholars of environmental justice speak of environmental injustice, they're thinking about it in terms of the process, the distribution, and also future generations. So procedural, we'll start here, right? Procedural inequity involves issues of fair treatment in the governing, in the making of rules, regulations, and evaluation criteria. So for an example of procedural inequity would be when, and this has happened in many cases, companies will use English materials to tell non-English speaking communities about the hazards that are going into their neighborhoods. So they're being entirely left out of the process because the flyers about the meeting are in English and the people that live near the facility don't speak English, for example. Or when, and this happens as well, meetings about facilities are held in remote locations, like 30 miles away on the other side of the urban area, not in the community where the people live and are available to learn about the facility. Distributional equity has to do with how both good and bad aspects are distributed across space. So for example, we can think about the distribution of parks. So in a city, are parks equitably distributed? Does everyone have access to parks? We can also think about it in terms of the distribution of hazardous waste facilities, factories, power plants. Where are they located in relation to the people that surround those areas? Third, we have intergenerational equity, and Tim mentioned this already when he was speaking, but this has to do with fairness for future generations. So decisions we make today that have procedural and distributional elements, right, in the future, what is the outcome of these decisions going to be? How are your children, your future grandchildren going to be impacted? That's an issue of intergenerational equity. So within environmental injustice, we also talk about environmental racism. And this is specifically environmental injustice that has this racial element or racial component. So this is when the environmental injustice, right, the rules, the regulations, the policies that governments or corporations enact disadvantage communities because of their race for least desirable land uses. And this can be intentional, more often it's institutional, right? It's part of the process that has these racialized outcomes. So related to distributional inequity as well, it's the unequal protection against hazards and the exclusion of people of color from the environmental decision making, and that's the procedural injustice affecting their communities. So we think about environmental injustice related to class, and then specifically related to race, we have this concept of environmental racism. So now I'm going to shift into the environmental justice movement. So like other social movements in this country, right, the environmental justice movement is as well a social movement that has been around for, depending on your perspective, right, 30 to 40 years. So there was some key federal action that set the stage for the environmental justice movement to happen. And one of these key federal actions is the actual creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. So before 1970, the U.S. did not have a federal environmental regulatory agency. Nixon actually created the EPA. It was the first federal environmental statute in the United States in 1970. And this set the stage then for NEPA, which is the National Environmental Policy Act. And this is the act that requires environmental impact statements before any building takes place. And NEPA emerged in 1970 because people in the United States were getting very upset with the destruction of neighborhoods and the natural environment that came along with the building of the interstate highway system, both in urban and rural areas in the United States in the 1950s and 60s. So the government came in, they put the freeways in without any regards to what used to be there, which in urban areas was often minority neighborhoods, and in rural areas was scenic countryside. And so there was widespread protest for this, and so the United States government passed NEPA that now requires environmental impact statements. And then thirdly, in 1986, again under Reagan, we have what's known as EPCRA, the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act. And this has been really, really important for environmental justice activism, because what it did is it requires that American industries disclose information about what types of hazards they release into the environment. And so they have to report what they release. And so what it means is you can go online and look up what is released. You can search by facility, you can search by zip code, you can search by city. So if you have a facility in your neighborhood, you can go look it up. You can see what it releases. And so this gives a lot of power to environmental justice activists. And if you go to rtknet.org, it has all the data there. I looked it up for you guys. So there are toxic releases in Menominee. There's 4 facilities right here in your community. You could look up exactly what types of chemicals they release. Of course, given federal budget pressure, this is all self-reported. The facilities report their own emissions. They're not checked very often. Nonetheless, it does provide important information. So of all cities in Wisconsin, you guys are 24, and you're 26th out of all U.S. states here in Menominee. So if you go to rtknet.org, you can plug this in. You can learn more about hazards in your community. This is a direct outgrowth of EPCRA and the fact that the government said, look, you have to tell people what you're releasing. All right, so now specifically the environmental justice movement. This movement emerged in the 1980s, and it was galvanized, of course, that environmental legislation set the stage, right? It raised awareness and provided tools, but the movement itself was really galvanized with a specific case in a small town in North Carolina called Afton, North Dakota. And Afton is a small town located in Warren County. And North Carolina basically licensed a hazardous waste landfill in Afton, North Carolina. It's a rural, low-income African-American community. And they were going to deliver 6,000 truckloads of toxic soil to this newly constructed, newly permitted hazardous waste landfill. And the community was furious. They'd been left out of the decision-making process. They were protesting it, it didn't matter, right? They weren't seeing any action. So they basically laid down in the road to stop the trucks, which were coming with this toxic soil. There were 6 weeks of marches, nonviolent street protests, more than 500 people were arrested, and it was the first recorded arrest in U.S. history over the siting of a landfill. So eventually, the people of Warren County of Afton, North Carolina lost the battle. The landfill went in, the hazardous waste was delivered. But this case drew a lot of national attention. And so for the first time, we had national attention on the issue of environmental injustice. And many people consider this case to be the first major milestone of the environmental justice movement. Of course, there were previous examples of people resisting, right, environmental contamination. Latino farm workers in the 1960s, organized by Cesar Chavez. In 1967, African-American students took to the streets of Houston protesting a landfill. But this was the first time it really got national attention. And so it's considered to be a watershed moment in the environmental justice movement. Another thing with the development of the environmental justice movement is community activists fighting against environmental problems using justice as a core orienting principle, but having scientific research undergirding their movement and activities. And so if we think back to the beginning of the movement, there were 2 key studies. In 1983, the U.S. General Accounting Office studied the 8 southeastern states in the U.S. and found that 3/4 of the hazardous waste landfill sites were located in poor Black and Latino communities. This was followed up then in 1987 by the United Church of Christ Commission on Racial Justice, and they studied the whole country and found that race was the single most important factor in determining where toxic waste facilities were located in the United States. So this academic research undergirded this movement of activists fighting against environmental problems. And so the environmental justice movement was an agglomeration of all sorts of different movements, which I'll get to in a moment, as well as this linking of issues of social, economic, political marginalization of women, minorities, and the poor, specifically related to the environment, which was a spin-off of the civil rights movement. So in terms of the foundations of the movement, I've already given you some ideas here, right? The civil rights movement was critical. Many of the early EJ activists were coming from the civil rights movement. They also used the same tactics as they used in civil rights struggles: marches, petitions, rallies, coalition building, community empowerment, etc. And many of the veterans of the civil rights movement, often affiliated with the church, showed up in Afton, North Carolina to help with that struggle, which is part of what raised the status of that specific protest. I've already mentioned academics, the anti-toxics movement, right? People interested in cleaning up the production process. Native American struggles, the labor movement, and also traditional environmentalism. Groups like the Sierra Club, which were so influential in the Asarco case, also were getting on board with the environmental justice movement. So this leads us now to the 1990s. And you could really see evidence of the environmental justice movement and its success at the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. This happened in 1991. It brought together hundreds of environmental justice leaders from the US, Canada, Central America, etc. Attendees included Reverend Jesse Jackson, Right Dolores Huerta, Tribal Chair Cherokee Wilma Mankiller, as well as representatives from the Sierra Club. And this was really evidence that mainstream had taken up environmental justice. So at this summit, the attendees decided on 17 principles of environmental justice. And I'm not going to read you word by word all 17, but I actually want to go through a key sort of highlight of each one because they're so intimately connected to this theme of multiculturalism and sustainability. And you'll see echoes of these principles being violated in the Asarco case as well as in future cases that we'll talk about today. So these 17 principles include valuing the sacredness of Mother Earth, right? Public policy that is free from discrimination, investment in a sustainable planet, right? Universal protection from nuclear testing and hazardous waste, self-determination of all people, right, which could be a definition of multiculturalism, as well as holding producers accountable for the toxics they've created, as well as stopping the production of very hazardous chemicals. You see here procedural justice, right, involving everyone who is interested at the level of decision making. It also targets the work environment, right, a safe and healthy work environment. Number 9, full compensation for damages, so this includes the right to health care. It calls government acts of environmental injustice a violation of international law, so it connects to those broader documents related to human rights. It affirms the special relationships of Native Americans to the land and their opportunity to self-determine. Number 12, we honor the cultural integrity of our communities. 13, the issue of informed consent and not testing on people of color and low-income people without their consent. The destruction, they oppose the destructive operations of multinational corporations, opposing military occupation, calling for the education of future generations, and then also asks that we make personal and consumer choices to use as little of Mother Earth's resources as possible. So you can see that the environmental justice principles cover a lot of ground and could be read as a document that lays out some principles of what sustainable living might look like. If you want to read them again, you can use your Google search. They are available online. So to continue my environmental justice movement, a little history for you. The last big moment to date was Executive Order 12898. And this was signed by President Clinton in 1994. And this put environmental justice into U.S. environmental policy in a more explicit way than it had ever been before. So Clinton himself appointed environmental justice leaders, Reverend Chavez, who was the leader of that United Church of Christ study in 1987, as well as Robert Bullard, who was an academic working in Houston, who was an early leader of the environmental justice movement. So he appointed these two EJ leaders to his natural resources team. And then in 1994, he signed, there he is, the Executive Order 12898, which indicated that the government must start focusing on the disproportionate burdening of poor and minority communities with environmental hazards. So an explicit statement at the federal level about the importance of considering environmental justice when making federal policies and decisions about the environment and health. So this is a big moment in the history of the environmental justice movement. What issues has the environmental justice movement tackled? All sorts of things, right? Ranging from waste facility siting, urban industrial pollution, childhood health concerns like asthma, as well as developmental issues connected to lead poisoning, leaky landfills, the export of toxics to the global south, land rights, etc. So the leaders of the environmental justice movement have been involved in a lot of issues. So what's going to happen next is we have some case studies about environmental injustice. Do you think I should do them both or just one? Do you want one case or two?
One at a time.
Well, of course, one at a time. I'm going to do the second one first. I think you might like that one better. It's less statistical. I don't know if you guys like stats. All right. So I'm going to talk about one of the two cases at the moment, and this is an example of procedural environmental injustice. The other case that I had was distributional injustice. But I think this case will be interesting to you because a lot of people don't realize what I'm about to tell you, which is that people in the United States don't have access to running water. They don't have access to toilets that flush. And this is actually surprisingly common in the US-Mexico border region. And so it's a procedural injustice case related to lacking water in Texas colonias. This is a picture of people who live in a colonia. In Spanish, colonia just means neighborhood. In English, it implies these specific types of neighborhoods that are unplanned and lack basic access to infrastructure. So what are colonias? They are unplanned, unincorporated, semi-rural subdivisions. In El Paso, Texas, as you've been gleaning, I think, so far today, it's in the middle of the desert, right? And so these are trailers and self-constructed housing units, basically in the middle of the desert. So water and drinking water is a serious concern. So colonias have high poverty rates. They often lack adequate, people that live there lack adequate access to healthcare. They live far from clinics and don't often have the transportation needed to get where they want to go. They also have very high rates of uninsurance. They lack basic infrastructural public services such as water and sanitation services. And when people say colonias, they're usually talking about these types of settings on the US-Mexico border. Right? Certainly other people in the United States lack access to drinking water. This occurs on remote Native American reservations. Homeless populations struggle with access to drinking water. But this is a specific case along the US-Mexico border. These are some more photographs from colonias. What I'm presenting to you today is the results and the work of one of our graduate students, Yolanda McDonald, who did this topic and project for her master's thesis. So here you see, this is where people store water that don't have access to running water. This is a large tank in their backyard. They fill it up with water and then use it. They have to, of course, maintain the chemicals themselves, the chlorine and everything, since it's not coming from the city. This family here has water in these plastic bins outside. And so this is basically what they look like. Colonias are located all along the border. There's a huge cluster of them in South Texas. This is El Paso over here, where I'm talking about today. But certainly these issues occur all along the border. So why do we have colonias? And I'll take you, this will arrive at an example of procedural environmental injustice. So the colonia phenomenon is an outcome of rapid growth along the US-Mexico border, related to industrial development on the Mexican side, and that coupled with the poverty of the residents, right? Because if they had options to live elsewhere, most people would choose a home that was connected to a water system. So in the 1970s, the poverty of many El Paso residents made it nearly impossible for them to purchase their own home, right? So apparently, according to some research I was reading, in 1976, 70% of people who wanted to buy a home in El Paso couldn't qualify for a loan. So they were unable to work through the formal structure of a mortgage to get a home. At the same time, they were doing redevelopment in downtown El Paso, raising the tenements where low-income people used to live, and then evicting them. So this created a situation where there was a market for this type of housing on the edges of the city where people could buy their own home and own their own home. The problem is that the colonia residents often have not a mortgage, but what's called contract for deed. And this tends to occur not just in colonias, it occurs in other settings as well, but it's very common in this setting. And this occurs when low-income buyers don't have the credit or the financial resources to qualify for a traditional mortgage. And so what they do is they enter into this agreement called contract for deed, where the seller maintains the deed for the home until the final payment is made by the buyer. So for example, Tim and I own a house. We have a mortgage. It's a 30-year mortgage. We're going to be paying every month for 30 years until we own our house. If we decide to sell the house, if we run into serious financial problems, we have the equity we've already paid in our house. That's ours. But if you buy a home for contract for deed, you pay every month. But let's say you run into hard times and you miss a payment. You just lose the house. So you don't build up any equity, and so it's very risky. And this is over the course of 30 years. Right? Mortgages happen over a long time frame. And so it's a very exploitative process that favors the owner of the home and the landlord, and it disadvantages the tenant or the buyer because you miss a payment, they can take away your home and you don't get anything from paying all those years on the home. And so this is the traditional way that these homes have been purchased because the families can't qualify for a traditional mortgage. Some of that has to do with economic status, but there's also some evidence in the 1990s in El Paso that independent of economic standing, Hispanic families were turned down at a rate twice that white families were for mortgages. So there was this race element to getting a home loan. Although when this was made public in the mid-1990s, the problem got quite a bit less, apparently. But that's the mid-1990s, right? We're talking the 70s and 80s here as well. So how many people live in these types of settings? It's hard to know for sure. There's issues with the US Census and trying to count people in informal developments. But as of December 2010, the Texas state estimates that about 370,000 Texans live in 1,800 colonias. So 45,000 Texas residents live in 353 colonias, which are classified as red. So Texas has this red, yellow, green system. And red colonias means that they don't have wastewater systems or they don't have potable water. So they either have cesspools for their household waste or they don't have access to potable water. So these are families that are seriously lacking the sanitation services that they need. So the problem's pretty large, right? This is a lot of people. How many people live in Menominee? 16,000, right? So a couple of Menominees living in these types of environments in the state of Texas. So one injustice is that this is expensive. So you don't have a tap in your home that you turn on and you get city water. You have to basically get someone, this is a water hauling truck. It's a big truck filled with water, this is a pipe. And you get this pipe and you put it in your tank, and it's very expensive. The Pan American Health Organization, that's Marcelo Cork here in El Paso, did a study last year, well 2 years ago now, and they found that if you have to buy your water this way, it's 5.5 times more expensive than if you get it from the public utilities. So the water is very expensive, and also, as I mentioned before, you have to maintain it yourself by testing for chlorine, like you might at a pool or hot tub, right? You have to test it and make sure that it's safe. It's even more expensive if you get your water from one of these water mills, which are very common in the colonia environments. And this is where you just bring your jug and you put it under there and you get water that way, which is more expensive. But the quality of the water here is a bit more guaranteed than this water. So we also have a risk of contamination. And this is a little chart, as I mentioned to you earlier, our student Yolanda McDonald, she basically went door to door in 75 colonia residents that lack piped water and 75 residents that had access to piped water but still lived in an informal settlement, but the pipes had been connected. And she tested the water, and she found, sorry my little red circle's a little bit down, she found that 35% of those that lacked water from a municipal source, right, they lacked regular tap water, had water that didn't meet the EPA standards for chlorine, which, right, you put chlorine in to keep it from growing bacteria and things that make you sick. 16% didn't meet the turbidity, and that has to do with the clarity. It's a physical property of the water. And then 44% didn't meet the EPA standards overall for drinking water. And so the water, you know, it's difficult to maintain the water, and it may not even arrive properly chlorinated. Because in the state of Texas, the water haulers water, that was these guys, the water there isn't regulated. And so they have to just maintain it because they want to. So the last point here is the one that is the most important, and that is, why is this a case of procedural environmental injustice? First off, most scholars would agree that the development of colonias in the first place is a result of past institutional racism. In the 1960s, before the 1960s in the state of Texas, Mexican origin people, despite being a significant part of the population, had no representation whatsoever in the Texas political system. Another example connected to procedural environmental injustice is that in 1978, the water utility company for the county of El Paso made a decision that they would not extend water or sewer lines beyond the county. So beyond the city limits to the county areas. So this is a policy and a procedure that very systematically disadvantaged all the residents living in the colonias who lived outside of the city limits. So the water utility enacted this policy that created this environmental injustice for residents living outside of the city limits. By 1995, the El Paso Water Utilities does regulate the entire county. There are also other little water districts that have popped up. And water has been being extended to colonias sort of one by one. Both the federal and state government provide some money for this. But basically, why do the colonias lack water? Why did they lack water? Certainly the political context in Texas, a pro-real estate, sort of pro-business state, as well as the fact that the El Paso Water Utilities is a for-profit water district. The goal is to make money, and in fact, they were one of the most profitable water districts in the country. And so if you want to make money, you don't build water lines way out in the desert to poor people's homes, right? That's not a way to make a lot of money. It's an important service, but it's not a way to generate profit. And so you also have this high cost of building water. You saw these developments in my photos, semi-rural, they're way out there, and so it's very expensive. And it's a poor population who lives there who can't afford to pay extra for the service. So there you go. Now to conclude, Tim is going to give us one more case and then argue for the need for a cosmopolitan EJ ethic.
Okay. You're trying to think about cases to do. We've done a lot of research of our own, but most of the research has been done in the El Paso, Ciudad Juarez area, Arizona. And we thought that this case here of electronic waste is a good case to discuss because it implicates our everyday lifestyles, the gadgetry that we all rely on an everyday basis in our lives. Okay? And so electronic waste, also known as e-waste, is an interesting case because it exemplifies how our hazardous wastes, and when I refer to our, I'm talking about people living in the global north, relatively wealthy countries, people refer to it sometimes as the developed world, how those wastes, that waste stream that we create, is increasingly being shifted to the global south, or low to middle income countries, what people also refer to as the developing world. And there are other examples we could discuss to try to make this point here. Plastic bottles, waste incinerators, incinerator ashes, other forms of municipal waste. Pesticides have often been shifted, ones that have been banned in the United States, for example, like DDT, still in use in some global south contexts. Shipbreaking is another case that people have probably heard some things about. Okay. Anyway, since World War II, wealthy nations of the global north have generated increasingly large volumes of hazardous chemical waste, which is the result of technological developments across many industry sectors, as well as a consumer culture that has grown increasingly accepting of risk in what sociologists often refer to as late modernity, this period following World War II. It's estimated that nearly 3 million tons of hazardous waste from the US and other global north countries cross international borders each year. And of the total volume of hazardous waste produced worldwide, about 90% originates in high-income countries of the global north. A significant proportion of the huge volume of hazardous and recyclable materials that really require special processing because they're toxic and damaging to human health to handle without proper considerations, that enter the waste stream in our country and other wealthy countries every year are diverted to these low and middle income world regions, what I'm referring to as the global south. And the point I want to make here is that the transnational movement of these hazardous wastes from the global north to the south demonstrates the need for developing what some people have referred to as a cosmopolitan environmental justice ethic in order to promote just and sustainable community development worldwide. And I'll come back to this in the end, but the point here is that much of the environmental justice movement is rooted in what some people refer to as a not in my backyard or NIMBY philosophy. And the point here with the cosmopolitan EJ ethic is that we actually need to move to something that other authors have referred to as the NOPE, or not on planet Earth ethic. Okay. This case also reveals how the consumer culture that we're all entrenched within in this country is pretty deeply implicated in the production of environmental injustices. And really what it points to is the need for some sort of profound cultural changes, and eventually the emergence of some new worldview that is genuinely sustainable, non-exploitative. So e-waste encompasses a broad and growing range of electronic devices ranging from household appliances like refrigerators, air conditioners, to consumer electronics, things like cell phones, TV, stereos, and really the big one, personal computers. This hazardous waste stream is being generated even ever more rapidly every day as technologies become obsolete more and more quickly. So at one time, consumers would buy a TV or stereo. We'd expect it to work for a long time, a couple decades. I remember the TV that I had when I was a kid. It was still around when I was like 20-something. It was like a 20-year-old TV by the time it finally crapped out, right? And when I needed that TV to be repaired, or my family did, they took it to a television repair shop. There were stereo repair shops. There were repair shops for all sorts of standard household appliances. And we all know today, these technologies that we use in our everyday lives, it's a disposable item these days. So the TV becomes disposable when its life cycle's over. The cell phone does. The computer becomes antiquated. These days, the time to when a computer becomes antiquated keeps ramping up too. In the 90s, it was something like 6 years. So in 1997, the average lifespan of a computer in the US was 6 years. In 2005, the average lifespan was about 2 years. And so this constant need to stay on the latest technology in the country means that we're producing more and more waste, more and more obsolete technologies more quickly. The United States remains the chief source of electronic waste since US consumers purchase more computers than the citizenry of any other nation. The situation in Europe isn't really much better. An estimated 1 million tons of e-waste is produced in the United Kingdom each year, for example, and that's increasing 5% every year. Now, about 80 to 90% of this waste is thrown into landfills. So there was a study by the US EPA in 2007, and of the 2.25 million tons of television, cell phones, and computer products that were ready for end-of-life management, that's the term, 18% were collected for recycling. Less than 20% actually collected for recycling. 82% actually disposed of in landfills. When these products are illegally disposed of, which is when you dump a television into a landfill, when you dump it into your household waste stream, you're dumping it illegally that way. When those materials get actually dumped and crushed into a landfill, lead, huge amounts of lead are released in the environment, as well as other heavy metals. And these hazards threaten future generations, as well as just the current ecosystem health of an area. Groundwater supplies can be compromised over the long term through this contamination. So it's a serious problem. A lot of the waste then, the electronic waste I'm talking about going to the south, a lot of it does get disposed of here. Illegally in landfills, seeps into the groundwater supply. It's a long-term problem that hasn't been confronted in this country. Okay, so e-waste is the most rapidly growing waste problem in the world. The ingredients, though, in this waste stream are especially of concern. You have lead, beryllium, mercury, cadmium, brominated flame retardants. For example, of the 315 million computers that became obsolete between 1997 and 2004, those contain 1.2 billion pounds of lead. And so computer sales keep ratcheting up. The problem is going to be amplified in coming decades. Now, rather than facing the problem squarely, the United States and many other wealthy countries that use most of the world's electronic products and generate most of the e-waste have made use of a rather convenient escape valve, and that basically involves exporting the e-waste crisis to poorer countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Now, due to Greenpeace's efforts to expose this toxic nightmare, the town of Guoyu, China has actually become known as sort of this global e-waste capital. Although there are many other places throughout the world where there's serious impacts from this e-waste problem, the town of Guoyu has actually received quite a bit of publicity, and there's quite a bit of information available about this situation in China. So in China, much e-waste arrives illegally via container in the port of Hong Kong, right? Where it is then trucked to places like Guoyu. And these are just your typical trucks moving into Guoyu, China. So in towns such as Guoyu, people often work in on-the-street or backyard operations where primitive, unsafe, and unregulated practices are used. Such practices include opening cathode ray tubes with hammers, exposing the toxic phosphor dust inside, cooking circuit boards over open fires, producing toxic lead fumes in the process, burning wires in open piles to melt away plastics, all sorts of burning, which releases really toxic compounds into the atmosphere and the surrounding environment. Throwing the unwanted hazardous leaded glass into former irrigation ditches, dumping pure acids and dissolved heavy metals into nearby rivers. These are the things that happen every day in places like Guoyu, China. Now, the environmental and health effects of this activity are extremely damaging. The air is not safe to breathe. The water is not safe to drink. Lead and other poisonous metals course through the veins of the residents of Guoyu. Greenpeace actually sent crews to Guoyu to measure ground samples and to test the water supply. Over 10 heavy metals were found, such as lead, mercury, tin, cadmium. Drinking water has to be trucked in since the local river and underground water table are poisonous. This has led some people, again, to truck in water supplies. On the other hand, people still use the water from nearby waterways and from the groundwater supply for local household uses. These people are in need of it. Okay? In Guoyu, pregnancies are 6 times more likely to end in miscarriage, and 7 out of 10 children are born with 50% higher levels of lead in their blood than children born elsewhere. 88% of workers suffered from neurological, respiratory, or digestive abnormalities. Many people suffer from some form of skin disease in this context. Now, the thing that's probably most shocking from a health perspective is due to all the burning, this sort of open-air burning of these materials, is the exposure to dioxin that these people experience. And dioxins are some of the most toxic chemicals known to science. According to the US EPA, there appears to be no safe level of exposure to dioxin. In addition to cancers, dioxins can cause serious reproductive and developmental problems. I won't read the list. There's a long list of disorders that can be read off right here that dioxins cause. And the residents are only partially aware, of course, of all these negative health effects. They understand that the environmental conditions are not great, but the higher than average wage keeps people working in Guoyu in these jobs. Workers in Guoyu can earn up to about $8 a day, which is almost 5 times what they could earn as peasant farmers. And with a lack of major industry in the immediate area, even more were previously unemployed, and so their destitution has actually driven them to work in these sorts of hazardous conditions. And activists involved in this issue have lamented that these people have to choose between poverty and poison, which is something that no person should have to do. But that is the sort of conundrum these people encounter. So what are some of the implications of this case? Okay. First off, you could ask the question is, why is our waste disposed of in places like Guoyu, China? First off, you have the increased production of waste and the emergence of stricter regulations in poor countries. Okay? And this has led to relatively high disposal costs in places like the US. Right? And so ironically, the grassroots social movement, including the environmental justice movement, against toxic waste industries in countries like the United States has inadvertently led the movement of these industries to the south. And it's very difficult these days to, for example, site a waste incinerator in an American community. If you propose to site a waste incinerator in nearly any US community, the opposition that you will face is extreme. And so, and there are laws that have been put in place in this country that regulate emissions. There are labor laws on the books. All of these sorts of technologies and labor laws, to enforce them and to follow them, leads to higher costs. Wages have to be paid to workers that are much higher. Okay? And there are other examples of how the movement, the environmental movement in this country, has sort of inadvertently led to this movement of hazardous toxins going to other countries. And I brought up the example of DDT earlier. You know, the movement, the environmental movement in the U.S. was very successful in getting a ban on the use of DDT, pesticide here, and DDT is still used today in the global South. Okay. So at the same time, you have reduced wealth and regulation, as well as debt in many of these global South countries. This leads to lower disposal costs. Okay. You also have the power of economic globalization. And really, this problem is rooted in a simple but brutal economic calculus. Some activists have noted that the reason is because it's 10 times cheaper to send it to China than it is to recycle it here in the United States. And finally, as David Pello, who's a sociologist who studies environmental justice, has argued, basically underpinning this is a racist and classist ideology that suggests it's actually okay for this to happen. We'll accept it. This is an acceptable outcome. Okay? And I'm going to flash through these slides because I think we need to be sort of wrapping this up sometime soon here. But the United States is one of the only countries in the world to not ratify the Basel ban. The Basel ban actually aims to address the transboundary movement of hazardous wastes. I believe it's Haiti, Afghanistan, and the United States are the only countries that haven't ratified it. The U.S. has actually actively worked to weaken the Basel ban. All right? Despite the fact that the ban has widespread support and was adopted by a consensus of countries that were party to the convention. Okay. Now, with the election of President Obama in 2008, there was actually optimism about change of the U.S. position on this issue. And the Basel Action Network posted a report, and the Basel Action Network is a group that an organization focused on confronting this hazardous waste transnational movement problem. And they actually posted a headline, "Obama win bolsters hopes of some sort of national electronic waste legislation." Well, it still hasn't happened yet. And in 2009, they had another headline. And basically, the Obama administration hasn't made progress on this. Now, some analysts of this e-waste problem assert that this is the big stumbling block, the lack of regulatory action in the US, the lack of our commitment to ratifying the Basel ban, for example. And the question that I would ask, and that other people have asked about this, is would ratification of the Basel ban by the US or more stringent US legislation resolve this e-waste problem? Okay? And I would argue that there may be some headway that would be made, but the problem, the incentives that exist to ship loads of waste from the global north to global south, that brutal economic calculus would still be in place regardless of those sorts of policy moves. Now, there's as an example of sort of the mentality, the economic mentality that underpins this movement of waste. Here's a quote from something called the Summers Memo, and Lawrence Summers at the time was the chief economist and vice president of the World Bank, and he wrote this memo that he circulated internally, and he stated, "Should the World Bank be encouraging more migration of the dirty industries to lesser developed countries? I can think of 3 reasons. 1, a given amount of health-impairing pollution should be done in the country with the lowest cost, which will be the country with the lowest wages. I think the economic logic behind dumping a load of toxic waste in the lowest wage country is impeccable, and we should face up to that. 2, I've always thought that the underpopulated countries in Africa are vastly underpolluted. Their quality is probably vastly inefficiently low compared to Los Angeles or Mexico City. 3, the concern over an agent or a pollutant that causes a 1 in a million change in the odds of prostate cancer is obviously going to be much higher in a country where people survive to get prostate cancer in the country." And so from my perspective, these are pretty shocking shocking statements that Lawrence Summers made. And so the question that might be asked would be, was he ostracized from the mainstream economic community for these sorts of statements? Does anyone know what Larry Summers did in the intervening years since this memo was leaked? Okay, well, I'll tell you, Larry Summers is a very influential economic policy maker. From 1995 to 2001, he was the Deputy Secretary and Secretary of the Treasury of the United States under President Clinton. He's a card-carrying member of the Democratic Party, actually. Okay? He was president of Harvard University. Most recently, at the federal level, he was the director of President Obama's White House Economic Council. And so his comments really do reflect neoclassical economic thought as it's practiced globally, in a globalized world. The decision-making of moving these wastes from countries like the US to places like China is rooted in the type of economic thinking reflected in Larry Summers' comments. Okay. And the question could be posed also, is recycling the answer to these problems? And unfortunately, it hasn't proven to be the answer so far. We can discuss that more a little bit later. But despite our best efforts to develop recycling programs in this country, most of these e-waste that are collected for recycling in this country are shipped, usually illegally, to other countries. So 80 to 90% of the end markets for our computer waste that we actually donate, we're thinking we're being good citizens and dropping off our computer for recycling, those are diverted to places like China or Africa. Oftentimes we're thinking we're being good, we're donating our computer as a charitable contribution, thinking it will be reused. Supposedly only about 3% of computers that we donate for reuse to other countries are actually in a state where they can be upgraded in a way that will be useful for the recipient. And so, unfortunately, a lot of the stuff we send off that we think we're recycling, we're donating charitably, it ends up going to places like China. And really, the economic conditions, militate against responsible recycling programs being established. I'll leave it at that right now, but there's a lot of information on that. Okay. And this leads to sort of the conclusion that David Pellow had, a well-known sociologist, about this case. The production of social inequalities by race, class, gender, and nation is not an aberration or the result of market failures. Rather, it's evidence of the normal routine functioning of capitalist economies. Modern market economies are supposed to produce social inequalities and environmental inequalities. That's a provocative claim. But when you start studying these cases, it's hard to come to an alternative conclusion. Okay? So I'm going to flash here to some final conclusions to close things out. Okay? So again, to summarize, the transnational movement of wastes and hazards from the global north to south demonstrates the need for developing a cosmopolitan environmental justice ethic in order to promote just and sustainable community development. And this requires a shift from not in my backyard politics to not on planet Earth sort of worldviews. It also highlights the consumer culture within which we're all entrenched in the US and how this culture is involved in the production of ecological and social harm. In practical terms, it leads us to the conclusion that some sort of profound cultural changes are needed, and we need to embrace some truly sustainable, non-exploitative worldviews in order to achieve sustainability. Okay. And if these changes don't occur, it seems to us that all of our best-intentioned attempts to promote environmental justice and sustainability will ultimately meet stumbling blocks and fail.